First, want to thank everyone for tuning into this presentation, and especially want to thank Rick Hague for giving this presentation. Rick has been a part of Friends of the Dillon Ranger District for a long time and does hike tours of mining history sites every summer with us, and he's a big part of our organization. He's also a board member, so big thanks to Rick for being here and sharing his knowledge on this. So just kind of how we're going to do questions here. If you're tuned in via Facebook, you can just comment on the live video and I will relay them to Rick, and he'll ask them as they come up. And if you're in the Zoom link, you can just ask them in the chat box, and I'll do the same thing, get Rick's attention, and we can field the questions that way. And then we'll also have a little question and answer piece at the end. So yeah, I think with that, I can hand it off to Rick and we can get working here.
Okay, let me just do a share screen and hope all that works and everything. Okay, can everybody see that and hear me?
Yep, all good there, Rick. Looks great.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining me. Today we're going to talk, as you can see on the screen, about gold rushes of the 19th century. Not only about the gold rushes themselves, but also the significance of the rushes and what came out of them. Many times, most people that aren't particularly aware of either mining history or history in general assume that there was just maybe one, maybe two gold rushes in the United States in the 19th century. Maybe the California gold rush, probably everybody has heard of that. Maybe the Pikes Peak gold rush if you live in and around Colorado. But there actually were quite a number of gold rushes, and we'll talk about them as we get into this. But there were probably 5 or 6 major gold rushes, including California and Pikes Peak. So let's get going. Okay, this just a high level overview here. Believe it or not, and most people I think tend to look at gold rushes as the Wild West, and think of the movies and John Wayne and all that, and don't think beyond the actual things that they perceived happen. But gold rushes, as we'll see, are some of the most significant events in at least recent, let's say, last 300-400 years in recent human history, because of the impacts and the things that happened. First of all, and may not realize it, but especially in this country, it was a massive move from what had been a very autocratic existence under the King of England and many of the immigrants under monarchies in Europe to individual freedom. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But the one man, one vote concept really was highly supported and very common within the gold rushes themselves. The gold rushes themselves had some very important social and political impacts. For one, they encouraged worldwide immigration and conquest of frontiers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about Australia and South Africa and South America, in addition to North America. So they were certainly incentives for a lot of people to move from where they were and come to a political infrastructure, because for instance, out here in the US West, in Colorado, let's say, before the Pikes Peak gold rush, wasn't anything here. There wasn't any state government, no county governments, no nothing. And so with the influx of human beings into an area, they had to set up some type of structure to govern themselves and to maintain order. And two of the things I've listed in the slide are mining districts, and we'll talk more about that later. But then after the mining districts, states and counties, towns, and cities evolved. So gold rushes were very, very important in this sphere as well. And gold rushes, and again, this is true throughout the world, they had very, very important economic and financial impacts. The city of Denver, San Francisco, Johannesburg, South Africa, and there probably are others, owe their existence, owe their birth solely to gold rushes. And they promoted a tremendous amount of economic development in the areas where they occurred. And in the end, on whole continents like North America or Southern Africa. And following the gold rush itself, they many times fostered industrial development and trade, and they were vital for monetary development because they, after all, they supplied gold, and monetary development was based on initially gold and silver. And I have to mention at this point, for those of you, I'm sure everybody has heard of the movie The Wizard of Oz, and maybe even seen the 1939 movie. Believe it or not, and I give a different talk on this and have in the past. The Wizard of Oz, the actual story and the movie, everything is all about the silver boom in the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century. Believe it or not, that's what the Wizard of Oz is all about, including Dorothy and her little dog. Gold rushes have also led to wars and to conquests. The Spanish movement into South America and Central America, Mexico, was driven largely by gold. The Mexican-American War that developed in 1846 through 48, that was basically caused by, or one of the main causes was the fact that gold was rumored to have been discovered in California. So what the United States wanted, of course, was California. And so that resulted in part in the Mexican-American War. And the Boer War at the end of the 1890s in Southern Africa was largely a result of the grab for both diamonds and gold in South Africa. So I hope you can see that gold rushes are far, far more important and more fundamental, and have had tremendously more important ramifications than just a simple John Wayne Western Hollywood kind of movie. So let's get down to the basics. What exactly is a gold rush? Well, it implies that there's gold at the end of the rush, and it implies that there's a rush. Now, in most cases, I guess I could probably say all cases, the rush part of it has been defined by one author that I read as a period of feverish migration. And basically, what this has resulted in is a period of vast numbers of people moving into an area, and that's what the rush is all about. And it has typically lasted 1 to 3 years or so. That doesn't mean that the mining or the activity ended, but that's when the real rush of people into an area occurred. Cam, were you trying to signal me? No? Okay. So a rush must have a place to rush to. And in general, what has happened is that the place where the rush has rushed to is somewhere really isolated, sparsely settled frontier area. Colorado is certainly a good example of that. California is a good example of that. Certainly South Africa and Australia, where the gold rushes occurred there, were very, very sparsely settled. So there had to be a place where they rushed to. And there also, of course, had to be gold at the end of the rush. Now we'll talk about, there actually was a rush that occurred where only at the last minute did they actually discover gold there. So there almost was a rush with no gold at the end of it. And there was another case that we'll talk about where the rush was far, far more important probably than the actual gold that they found at the end of the rush. So a little bit interesting spin. I'll keep you on the edge of your seats until we get there. I talked about the fact that the rush itself was a relatively short time span, a few years at most. Now, in general, not true for all of these rushes, but in general, the type of mining that was first done and what they were rushing towards was placer mining. And placer mining is it's almost by definition, there is one example where this isn't true, but placer deposits are on the surface of the ground. They're not underground in general. And they also involve stream or river sediments. And there are many, many different types of placer deposits. Gold is certainly one of them and probably one of the more common ones, but placer deposits also but that's mostly what these people were rushing towards, were placer deposits. And in this area, in the Summit County area, the placers occurred in the Blue River area, French Gulch, the Swan River area, anywhere where there were stream sediments that was potentially fertile ground for these types of deposits. And these types of deposits were formed through erosion, in most cases over millions and millions of years. In this area, glaciers also played a very important part. The gold was originally put in place through very fundamental tectonic geological events that formed mountain chains like the Rocky Mountains, for instance. And then as erosion took place over millions of years and glacial action ground down the mountains, gold, as well as other minerals and other rock, of course, was eroded and ended up in the stream and river systems. So that's how placer deposits got there in the first place. And then secondly, I've got there on the slide, it's a guy thing. There were very, very few women involved in any of these gold rushes, except for one, and I'll talk about that before. Yes, certainly there were the prostitutes and the ladies of the night, that kind of thing, but they were very, very few compared to all the guys that were involved in this. And so what we're going to talk about when we start going through the gold rush here are, first of all, the people. Who were these people? Where'd they come from? How many were they? And many of them were, the gold rushes were associated with financial panics or depressions, economic depressions that occurred either in the United States or other places in the world. And we're also going to talk about the right to mine law, because how did these guys, once they discovered some gold, how did they ensure that they could mine it themselves, that somebody else wouldn't try to steal their find? So we'll talk about that. And I mentioned before that this is one of the very, very important things that gold rushes in general did, was it fostered a legal and governmental system. And we'll also talk about the technology. Where did the technology come from? that facilitated the mining during these gold rushes. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how they did this. And these are some old shots of, I'm sure we've all seen pictures of these. This is the most primitive and simple and lowest production way to mine gold. And basically all these guys did, you can see the gold pan there, and they went to a stream and they panned, and they got a bunch of sediment. You can see that guy on the right, a bunch of sediment in their gold pans. They swirled it around, and the light stuff, the idea was that the light stuff would swirl out over the top, and the very heavy stuff like gold and also iron minerals would collect in the bottom. So that's how they mined, and that's how they prospected, with pans like that. And one step up above panning, as far as production capacity is concerned, were the rockers or the cradles, and it was called rocking. And basically, there were a box that was set on some wood runners, and it was rocked back and forth like a baby's cradle. And you can imagine the guy, just look in the picture, this guy right here, he's rocking this cradle back and forth, and his partner is just shoveling in gravel in the top, and it goes down through this box, and there are a number of obstructions in the box, and they add water too, and the water carries the gravel down over some obstructions, and the gold settles out, hopefully, behind the obstructions, and that's how they recover the gold. So you can see here several examples of what these rockers looked like. This picture right here on the right, probably you can see the cars in the background. That's probably taken during the Depression. And in the Summit County area, this type of mining was very, very common during the Depression, because it wasn't very lucrative, but if you could make, say, $1 a day in the 1930s, that was better than starvation for many people. So that was very commonly done in the United States, and I'm sure worldwide. Okay, here's a third type of mining, placer mining. This is called sluicing, or the use of a long tom. And basically, this is just a three-sided, you can see on the left there, a three-sided wooden trough. And in the bottom of the trough, there are obstructions called riffles. They're just wood slats that are nailed across or transverse to the flow of water. And they build it in a place where water can be directed to flow through the sluice. And then guys shovel, you can see they're doing it in all these pictures. Guys shovel in the gravel, and the water carries it over the riffles. And hopefully, again, because of the gravity and heavy weight of gold and iron minerals, the gold will collect behind the obstructions or behind the riffles. This right here is a long tom. It's sort of a little bit of a variation on a sluice, and it's used in situations where you've got a lot of large rocks that you want to get out of the gravel that you're working. But it basically is the same. You direct water down a wooden chute, and on the end here, there's a screen that screens out any large rocks. Now, this picture on the left has one unusual feature in it. I usually ask my audiences when I'm doing this live, what's the unusual feature, but can't really do that with a Zoom meeting. The unusual feature is the woman here. And this picture was actually taken during the California gold rush, so in the early 1850s. And it probably was posed, because you can see she's in pretty decent clothes, and plus she's a woman. And like I said before, it's a guy thing. You rarely saw women in the field like this. Now here's another type of mining. This is called hydraulicking, and it's used in situations where you have high banks of loose gravel like this. You can see here. This is very commonly done in this area in Summit County. If you know what to look for, you can see examples of it all over the place. And it basically is a large fire hose. It involves bringing in water through ditches and canals from higher elevations and then directing it down a pipe that gets thinner and thinner as it gets closer and closer to this fire hose, and then directing it through a nozzle here that is 4 to 6 inches in diameter. And this piece of equipment right here is called a giant, or sometimes called a monitor. You may have heard those expressions, but you can see here how it works. Just a large stream of water that is directed up against the bank of these loose unconsolidated sediments, and then it just washes down through a sluice box like we just saw a picture of. So this type of mining was actually invented in California during the California gold rush, and it spread to other gold mining areas, certainly to Colorado during the Pikes Peak gold rush as a means of mining as well. And finally, even though we don't normally think of dredging as a placer mining technology, it in fact was. It was very, very high capacity mining, and basically it was used in situations where the sediments were the stream sediments, river sediments that they were mining were quite deep. Now you can imagine one of those individual prospectors, the gold panners that we saw, couldn't dig down very far. I mean, you were probably limited to sediments 5 feet deep or whatever you could dig down to. And so that limited them in situations where you have very deep sediments. And typically, alluvial gold tends to accumulate on top of bedrock because over the millennia, as you have this eroded gold being washed through the stream systems, it settles where it goes around curves or where the water flow slows down, and it settles down and it starts working its way down through the sediments, and it finally comes to rest at impervious zones, or zones where the water can no longer flow and where the water is contained. And many times that's bedrock. Many times you have beds of clay or sandstone in alluvial deposits too, but generally you're looking at bedrock. And sometimes, like I said, bedrock can be pretty deep. And these dredges, all three of these dredges are from this area. This right here in the background, this dredge is so-called dredge number 6, Tonopah number 1. And this is Shock Hill going up towards the Peak 8 ski area. And this picture, I'm not quite sure when it was taken. Like may have been in the probably in the 1930s, very, very early 1940s, but it's sitting in a pond here. And these dredges in this area could dig as deep as 90 feet. And this particular dredge right here went up to, if you know Breckenridge at all, went up to where the Dredge restaurant is right now, or now it's called Ollie's, I guess, but where the Dredge restaurant was in that pond. And it in fact died in that pond, sank and burned. And the Dredge restaurant is not the real dredge. That's actually made out of concrete, although it is floating. But this is the real dredge that was in that area. This dredge right here, you can see over on the right, is the one that you can still see some remnants of up in French Gulch, about 2 miles or so beyond the Country Boy mine. And that's in its final place. It died there, so to speak, in 1922. This one died in 1942 in the dredge restaurant pond there. And this is another dredge right here that went up the Swan River area. There were 2 dredges that worked in that area. But all 3 of these dredges work sediments that were 70 to 90 feet deep. Extremely destructive. And you can still see a lot of the dredge piles, or they're actually called spoils in the business, in the industry. You can see them especially in the Swan River, Swan Gulch. They're going up Tiger Road. They're trying to rehab that area right now. And you can also see them going up French Gulch as well. Tremendous piles of rock. And basically what these dredges did was to turn the stream bed or the riverbed upside down and cause tremendous environmental destruction. Anybody that's familiar with French Gulch or the Swan River area can attest to that. Okay, so let's get to the gold rushes themselves. Here are the major gold rushes of the 19th century.
Hey, Rick,
Just let you, yeah, go ahead.
can you talk a bit more about the environmental impacts on the Swan and French Creek from the dredging?
Yeah. You can see the effects. Now, if you go up the Swan, I think that's probably a good place to look. If you go in, about 4 miles from Route 9, you come to a place where they've actually completed some of the rehabilitation. And the idea was that they wanted to rehab it to its original condition. So you can see what it is there, versus if you go further up Tiger Road, you can see the dredge spoils up there. And basically what these dredges did, this is a bucket line. All these are bucket line dredges. And you can see the bucket line right here. And this, think of a bike chain and the 2 sprockets on either end, one where you pedal and one on your rear wheel. Well, that's how these dredge lines worked, and they just went around in a big circle, and they dug their way down to the bottom and brought the material up and fed it into the machinery inside. And the machinery inside separated out the very coarse boulders and big rocks, the very fine stuff. And the boulders and the rocks went up this basically a conveyor belt here, and were just dumped out the rear end of the dredge. The fine material was actually processed, and the gold was recovered right on the dredge itself, and then it was dumped behind the dredge as well. Well, one of the things, just as a rule of thumb, when you dig up ground like this, and this is true in your backyard too, if you went out in your backyard and picked up a shovel of dirt and then just dumped it on the ground, its volume expands by about 30%. And so that's why you get the very, very high, you can see them here, very high and in the back, piles of dredged rock, or the spoil piles. And what they're doing, you can see this bucket line here went down, in this case, right in front of Shock Hill, went down about 90 feet. And so it dredged this whole area that the dredge is sitting in, this pond. It constructed itself, it moves itself, and the pond moves along with it. And so it's digging a big hole, you can see there. And if you familiar with the dredge restaurant in Breckenridge, you can see how big the pond is. It just digs right down to bedrock and then dumps all this material out on the surface. It's tremendously destructive. There isn't really any chemical contamination unless there's mercury used in the recovery process, but you can see how it's just turning the stream bed or riverbed upside down and just dumping it in big piles behind the dredge. Does that take care of that?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so again, just returning to the 6 major, we'll talk about each of these individually, but the 6 major gold rushes in North America in the 19th century, just to let you take a look at that list and you can see roughly when they occurred. Klondike was the last of them. And believe it or not, one you've probably never heard of, there was a gold rush it was actually somewhat earlier than 1825, actually, in North Carolina. I'll leave that up there just for a second so you can take a look at that. Here's California, and here's ours, Pikes Peak. By the way, another question that I always ask my live audiences is what part or what did Pikes Peak actually have to do with the Pikes Peak Gold Rush? And I'll answer that question for you. It had absolutely nothing to do with the Pikes Peak Gold Rush whatsoever. There was not any gold found at that time in the late 1850s, not any gold found anywhere near Pikes Peak. It wasn't until Cripple Creek was discovered later that gold was found anywhere near Pikes Peak. Pikes Peak was a navigational beacon. And when these rushers were coming across the plains of eastern Colorado, they could see this huge mountain. And that was what guided them west as opposed to south or north, west to the Rocky Mountains and to where the Pikes Peak Gold Rush actually occurred. So that's what Pikes Peak had to do with the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Now, these were other rushes. These were more minor that occurred in different periods as well in North America. And some of them were actually silver rushes. You can see Comstock here in the middle was a silver rush, and Tombstone and Globe, Arizona, those were silver rushes. But just take a look at this list of more minor gold rushes. And many times those that took part in these smaller gold rushes had gained experience from the larger gold rushes, like California Gold Rush, for instance. So it's pretty amazing how many rushes there actually were in North America alone. And here's a picture worldwide. Here are the major gold rushes that occurred elsewhere in the world. Victoria, of course, that's down in the Melbourne area in the 1850s. Queensland is up in the northeast part of Australia. Western Australia, there's a big gold rush out there. It's gold rush in New Zealand. Believe it or not, there was a gold rush in Germany and in South Africa in the 1880s, 1890s, and Chile, Argentina. Now that doesn't include, of course, the Spanish conquest, Spanish and Portuguese conquest of Latin America. That probably couldn't be described completely as a gold rush because it was not really a rush as I've defined it for us today. But these are the other major gold rushes in world history. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about North Carolina here. You can read most of this, I think, pretty carefully. If you know where Charlotte, North Carolina is, it was a band trending right through Charlotte, going from the northeast to the southwest. And there was quite a bit of activity there. The first discovery was actually made in 1799. And Conrad Reed went out one day. He was a farmer in the Charlotte area, and went out and in a stream, he found this really, really odd and really heavy rock. And he brought it home, didn't have a clue what it was, and used it as a doorstop for about 25 years until he finally got curious, I guess, and took it into somebody in Charlotte that knew something about rocks and geology and things like that. And they discovered that it was a piece of solid gold that he had been using as a doorstop for about 25 years. So that started, there were roughly, it's hard to say now this far after this rush occurred, but from what I've read, roughly up to 30,000 people came into the North Carolina area in this period right here, 1825 to the early 1830s. And one interesting thing was that this was really the first mining activity in the United States. This is pretty early in our republic's history. And so there weren't any mining laws. So how did people actually claim a discovery as their own so that nobody else could take it from them? Well, at that time and in North Carolina, the primary legal means was just private land ownership. These were primarily farms that were owned by the farmers. And what actually happened here was that it became a complement to their farming life. They farmed in the late spring, over the summer, and into the fall. And then during the winter, they actually gold mined. So that was how they actually did it. They had other people come into the area, this 30,000 or so, and they just needed the permission of the landowner, the farmer, to go and mine on the farmer's land, and presumably the farmer got a cut of the findings. And at that time, there was very, very little mining technology in the United States. And most of the people that knew anything about mining had come from Europe or from the mines, the gold mines in South America that resulted from the Spanish incursion into South America. So this was pretty much the story of North Carolina. And like I say, it lasted probably through the 1830s until the next gold rush, which we're going to talk about in a second here. But so it was a fairly short-lived gold rush, maybe 10, 15 years. And that's probably why you don't hear too much about it, is that relatively little happened and relatively little was found. But one of the interesting things I mentioned before in the introduction, that in general, women are not involved in these gold rushes. Well, this is the only one where they really were. And they were quite prominent in these operations. And many times they were the wives or the farmers. And what they were part of was a rocking system, was recovering the gold that the men actually dug out of the stream sediments. Again, these are alluvial deposits, remember, associated with streams and rivers. And so the men would actually, with shovels, dig these sediments, and they dump the sediments, the shovelfuls, into these rockers. And the women, I got a better picture next, these women would just stand on these rockers all day and rock back and forth. They were inclined, and they would introduce water, much like a sluice box. This was in fact a sluice box kind of arrangement, an early one, and the water ran through, carried the stream sediments over obstructions. You can see the obstructions there, and hopefully the heavy gold and other heavy minerals would settle out behind the obstructions. So again, and here's another case. This is an actual photograph where you can see the structure of these rockers, and you can sort of see that they're a bit inclined, and they're right along the banks of a stream. And here's poor Mrs. So-and-so standing up there all day, rocking back and forth, while her husband is using the shovel to carry the sediments up to the rockers so that the gold can be recovered. And here's a wheelbarrow that they used to do this. Picture taken in 1860. And also in the North Carolina gold rush, and the next one we'll talk about, slaves were used, certainly. This was an area and a period of slavery. So you can, I mean, it doesn't take too much imagination to recognize that, well, God, if these farmers had slaves to work farms, and they certainly used them to do the heavy work in the mines in the winters and at other times during the years. So right after North Carolina, gold was discovered in northern Georgia. And if anybody is familiar with that area, Dahlonega was sort of the center of things for the Georgia gold rush. And this took place roughly in the 1830s, let's say. Again, it was a rush, and they've estimated a few tens of thousands of 29ers, and they rushed into northern Georgia around the town of Dahlonega. And I'll talk more later, but this particular gold rush had a tremendous impact on Summit County, believe it or not. And this was the original discovery was made by a gentleman, supposedly not quite sure, named Benjamin Parks. Whoops. And I've talked about the right to mine. How did people secure a find for themselves so that somebody else didn't have a right to it? Well, Georgia used a bit of a different system. It put together a lottery, and I'll show you a picture of a grid that this lottery produced. But basically what they did was they went into the area where the gold was thought to exist, and they surveyed out blocks of land that were, I can't remember how large they were, but several hundred acres at least each. And then they put these in a lottery, and anybody that wanted to bid would put his money up, and he would be picked out of a hat, basically, and he would gain rights to a certain patch of land to mine. So that was how they did it in Georgia. The problem here was that most of the gold country in northern Georgia was occupied by the Cherokee Nation, Indian Nation. And it was really, really a tragic situation. The Cherokee Nation was quite large. It covered northern Georgia, southern South Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and northeastern Alabama. And the Indians just got driven out, and eventually they were forced out by federal edict, it turned out. And that's where you may have heard of the expression or the book, Trail of Tears. And that's where the Cherokee Nation was driven out of its homeland in northern Georgia, and many of them settled in Oklahoma. You can believe that, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But again, there are probably a few tens of thousands in the Georgia gold rush, and there was actually an associated financial panic or depression. It was the Panic of 1837, and that probably produced a lot of the people that actually took place in this rush, because they got left out of work, or their farms went bankrupt, and they didn't have anything else to do, so they joined the rush and participated in the Georgia gold rush. You may have heard the expression, there's gold in them thar hills, and this Georgia gold rush is where it came from, because the right towards the end of the 1840s, a lot of people started leaving Georgia and heading towards California in the late 1840s. And the mayor of Dahlonega got really, really desperate when he saw everybody else leaving. And he gave a big speech on the steps of the City Hall in Dahlonega, and pointing out to the hills, the mountains surrounding Dahlonega, and saying, there's gold in them thar hills, trying to induce them to stay in the Dahlonega area. But that didn't happen. Georgia Gold Rush faded. And here, most of the technology, most of the people had gained their experience in North Carolina. And here are a couple of pictures that date from, or their drawings, I guess, from the Georgia Gold Rush. And here's what the lottery districts looked like. And the spackled ones are areas of land where gold had been discovered, at least maybe a couple of flakes, so they were better bets than the places up here which don't have the spackles, where there was no known gold. So that's what it looked like, and these guys were they paid some money, and their names are drawn out of a hat to prospect and own one of these patches of land that originally was owned by the Cherokees. Okay, so then the next one time-wise was California, and we've all heard of the California Gold Rush. It began actually in 1848, excuse me, in January of 1848, when James Marshall was actually building a sawmill for a rich landowner in the area, and he discovered gold that was in the river on which he was building the mill. The mill was going to be run by water power. And if you know California at all, it's up in the foothills of the Sierras, about 40 miles northeast of Sacramento. And the rush actually started in 1848. And this was probably the biggest one of all. It was a worldwide gold rush to California. And they've estimated that roughly 300,000 miners or prospectors came from all over the world to California. So this is a good example, what I was speaking with before, about how a previously unsettled, relatively unsettled area, except for Native Americans and in this case a few Spaniards, was inundated with gold rushers, and which was settled and ultimately industrialized, etc. But a lot of things came out of the California Gold Rush, and one was the concept of the mining district and claim staking. And this was the system that we use today, actually. If you want to, you can even do it in Summit County, quite a few areas. You can stake a claim and gain legal right to whatever you find on the claim, and your right to mine it. It's a complicated system. I usually go into it, but we don't have time to go into the concept of what claims actually were. But the mining districts, this was before any civil government existed in this area. And it was a concept that was developed in California. And all of the miners in an area could join the district. They became members. And it was one man, one vote. This was one of the very early examples of true democracy. And they elected a president and a secretary, and sometimes they elected a sheriff as well. And that was how they governed themselves in those days. A mining district was generally defined by a drainage, let's say French Gulch, or by the Swan River area. It was geographically defined. And this California Gold Rush effectively shut down the Georgia Gold Rush. Everybody came here, including the people that ultimately discovered gold in Colorado and prompted the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, but I'll talk about them in just a little bit. The technology came from Georgia and North Carolina, and a lot of it was invented right on site. We talked about hydraulic mining before. Hydraulic mining and the mining district, its concept itself, were invented, I want to say that, call it that, in California and the California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush lasted from about 1848 into the very early 1850s, maybe 1852, 1853. And the rush of people stopped then. And certainly things carried on for years and years and years after that. But the initial rush was had ended. And here's the picture right here on the left of Sutter's Mill, and that's where gold was discovered. And the idea was that water was going to run under the mill here, and they were digging a channel so that the water could come off the river, and that's when they discovered gold. Here's an example of a sluice box, but you can see Chinese labor here, very distinctive for the California gold rush. And here's another example. This is the picture I showed before. A woman in the picture, very unusual, certainly in the California gold rush. Picture was obviously posed, I would guess. And here we are with the our very own Pikes Peak gold rush. This gold was first discovered right on Cherry Creek in the Denver area. And if you know where Cherry Creek comes into the Platte River, right where the REI store is, that's where gold was, very close to where gold was initially discovered. Pikes Peak is, the Pikes Peak gold rush is an example of a gold rush that actually happened and was underway before hardly any gold was discovered. So there was almost no gold. There was a rush, but no gold here. And what happened was that gold had a very, very small amount of gold had been discovered down near the REI store in what now is Denver in 1850 by a party of Georgians that were coming out here, and they were actually headed towards the California gold rush. And they passed through this area, and one night they camped on Cherry Creek. And you know, some people go fly fishing or something. Well, prospectors go prospecting, so they started gold panning in Cherry Creek. Came up with a little bit of gold, not much, but a little bit, and they just noted it. They just remembered it, but they were headed to California, so they continued on to California. Not really much indication of how they did in California, but we know that they did go back to Georgia. And in the late 1850s, Green Russell started thinking. He said, geez, I wonder what that gold that we discovered near those mountains was all about. And so he decided to go back to the REI store area and try to prospect and find some gold. And that happened in the summer of 1858. And they got here in the fall of summer fall of 1858, and that's when things started happening because they did discover a little bit of gold. Wasn't much here, but fortunately, some other people went out in the Boulder area, Gold Hill, Central City, Idaho Springs, and they did discover gold out in these areas here. And that, fortunately, they discovered gold because there were a lot of people rushing towards it. And then eventually, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush expanded first to South Park and then to Summit County, and primarily then the Breckenridge area, and then to Leadville. And that rush lasted from roughly the spring, let's say, of 1859 until the very early 1860s. And it ended primarily because the Civil War was just getting going then. And most of the prospectors that came out as a part of this Pikes Peak Gold Rush were from the Northeast. They were Yankees, and so they went back, and they went back to the Civil War. So that's what happened. They used the California Mining District and claim staking program to actually establish a governmental structure and a legal structure here. I've talked about the original discovery by Georgians. There were roughly, as far as anybody can say, roughly 100,000 people that participated in this rush. And believe it or not, a lot of these, this 100,000, including the initial Green Russell party, a lot of them were Cherokees that came from Georgia, or they were resettled, had been, quote, resettled, unquote, in Oklahoma. and they came out with Green Russell, and they had mining experience from the Georgia days, some of them, and they were some of the very, very early people that participated in the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. This gold rush was also associated with an economic depression, particularly in the East, the Northeast, Panic of 1857. And one of the things that fostered this depression of 1857 was the fact that a ship was hauling gold from California, went around the Horn, and was hauling gold up to the Northeast, and it sank off the east coast of the United States, robbing the economic system in the United States of a hell of a lot of gold. And that's one of the factors that contributed to the panic of 1857, was the loss of this ship of gold. And most of the technology actually came from California as part of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. So here are just a few pictures. This is a picture of Green Russell. He's the guy that discovered gold near the REI store in the Denver area, and then also came out to Summit County. This is Georgetown in the background, current day Georgetown. A couple of prospectors here, and this you might recognize this. This is downtown Breckenridge in about 1867. Don't know what this is. It might have been the Blue River or a channel dug for prospecting purposes. But this right here, you see this building, was a Silverthorne Hotel, and this is where downstairs at Eric's is now located, right in this location, precisely where my arrow is. Okay, then the next one, I'm sorry, I forgot about Cripple Creek. Cripple Creek occurred after the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and that rush occurred roughly 1891 to 92, 93. And if you know where Cripple Creek is, about 44 miles southwest of Colorado Springs. And this is unusual. The Cripple Creek Gold Rush was unusual because it did not initially involve placer deposits. This was a hard rock deposit, and the guy that discovered gold in the hard rock, this is in bedrock, was a guy named Bob Womack, and he actually had discovered gold as early as sometime in the 1870s, but he was basically the local drunk, and nobody believed him until he actually showed somebody some samples on October 20th in 1890, and that's when the Cripple Creek Gold Rush got underway, and the right to mine, the whole legal regimen had formalized tremendously since the Pikes Peak and California gold rushes. There had been passed on the federal level the General Mining Act of 1872. And that basically is what's in place today, believe it or not. The whole system of staking claims and things like that. Our whole mining law is based largely on this 1872 law. I've covered the fact that it was a hard rock deposit. This was a very localized deposit, geologically speaking. It was roughly a square, 6 feet by 6 miles by 6 miles. Not much outside of that 6 miles, but it was a huge gold discovery that involved lots of people coming there. And it also was accompanied by its own economic depression, the Panic of 1893. Remember before I mentioned that the Wizard of Oz is all about this panic. Can't get into the Wizard of Oz right now, but Cripple Creek was part of that. And again, a lot of these people that were unemployed, farmers that had gone bankrupt, took part in the Cripple Creek Gold Rush because they had no other means of support. And here, mining technology was getting fairly sophisticated, and the underground mining technology came from all over the world. And these were some of the first labor disputes, because these mines, as they eventually developed over the 1890s, became organized by union labor. So here's a few pictures taken from the Cripple Creek gold rush. These are placer mines here. There certainly was some placer mining, although Cripple Creek was mainly hard rock. This right, underground hard rock. This is Bob Womack, the guy that discovered it all. Doesn't look too much like a drunken sop there, but I guess he was. And this is just one of the areas where mining actually started taking place. Okay, here we come to the last real gold rush. This is the Klondike. And frankly, I'll be honest, when I first started studying gold rushes, I wasn't entirely sure where the Klondike is. It still is a place. I'll show you a map in just a second. But this is a case, remember I talked about the Pikes Peak gold rush being a rush that occurred where there almost wasn't any gold at the end of the rush. Well, this is a case where the gold was not immaterial, but the rush was, the important thing was the rush, because it was so large and covered such a wide, expansive area, and had such influence that I'll get into in a second about it. But the rush was quite spectacular, and it occurred in what now is Dawson City, the Yukon, and on the Yukon Klondike rivers. And it actually, gold had been discovered long before July 15th, 1898. But this area was so remote, still is remote, but so remote at the time that nobody in the world, except those that were right on site, knew about it at all, until a ship that had been up in that area, just normal freight shipments and people and things like that, the Excelsior, pulled into San Francisco on July 15th, 1898, and the secret was out. They announced it, and by then they had telegraph, and in some cases telephone throughout the United States, and the word got out really fast. And the rush started probably July 16th, and it occurred until the latter part of 1899. The original discovery, there actually had been gold that had been discovered in small amounts in the 1880s, but a guy named George Carmack actually was the original discoverer in August of 1896. Now here, the governing law is Canadian law, and that caused a lot of conflict, because most of the miners that came to the Klondike Gold Rush were Americans, and they were used to American law and the mining district and claiming system. Well, this was a very different system, Canadian law, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there are about 100,000, they called them stampeders, as I mentioned, Canadian law versus mining district law, and And in this case, there was never, and to this day, there is no underground mining. It was all placer deposits, and they never really knew where all this gold came from. But because it's so far in the north, it was a new brand of mining that they had to deal with. And it was mining in the permafrost, because very few inches underground, you were in solid ice, and you had to be able to mine in that area. So they had to develop methods for mining in that permafrost. And this, again, this Klondike gold rush was associated with the Panic of 1893, the Depression. That was the Depression that Wizard of Oz is all about. And a lot of cultural stuff came out of the Klondike gold rush. Jack London was involved up there. Robert Service, the poet, was also involved there. And this was a case where by the time, I said before that the gold was almost insignificant, the rush was the important thing. Well, the rush involved these 100,000 or so miners, but when they got there, most of the gold had already been claimed up by the original people like George Carmack. They had all staked their claims under Canadian law, and there weren't many areas that were available that had any gold left. So most of the people actually never did any mining, were very disappointed, and headed back home very, very quickly. So that's why I said before that the rush was probably more important than the gold at the end of the rush. So here's where Klondike is. If you're familiar with Alaska, Anchorage is right here. Fairbanks is up here. Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon, is right here. And the Klondike is up here in the middle of nowhere. It's still in the middle of nowhere. And the main access point was Skagway down in this area here. It's on the Alaska Peninsula. And there are several ways to get there, but most of the people that took place in the Klondike Gold Rush came in by ship into Skagway, and I'll show you some pictures here shortly, made their way on foot from the Skagway area into the Klondike. And here's again, I was saying the rush was the more important part probably of this rush. There were very, very famous and very dangerous and very difficult hikes because of the weather and the terrain. And here are two examples. These guys had to go across Chilkoot Pass. These are all people walking through the snow, through a snowfield, up over Chilkoot Pass right here. And these are places where they have stopped to rest or whatever. Another pass was White Pass. This is closer to Whitehorse in the Yukon. And again, all these are people trekking through the snow. And you can see what these guys look like here. One thing that caused a lot of grief, a tremendous amount of grief that you can imagine here looking at this line. Remember I said that the Klondike Gold Rush was done under the auspices of Canadian mining law. And one thing that they required, and they were absolutely strict on this requirement, they required each miner to bring a year's worth of provisions with him. He had to carry this on his back, and that's what this stuff is right here. Miners would come in by ship, and they would, by horse or however they got it there to here, they would bring in a year's worth of provisions, and then they'd have to carry these provisions up over these passes on their backs. And they had Mounties. The Canadian Mounted Police were up at the top of the passes here checking what was in their packs to make sure that they had a year's worth of provisions. So it was pretty tough. And this is just a couple of pictures. You can see all these people. This is in 1898, Dawson City. See all these people standing around? Remember I said that when they got there after this tremendous trek, there was not much gold available for them because it had been all claimed up. There just wasn't any gold-bearing ground to occupy these guys. So many of them just turned around and headed back. And this is Bonanza Creek back in 1898, where it all happened, where the mining was. And this is a picture I took when I was up there in 2010. You can see some similarities. Actually, this is Main Street in Dawson City, and this is Bonanza Creek right here. Okay, so that's it. these are just some random pictures of some of the people that took part in these various gold rushes. Here's one of a few women that you'll ever see, and probably guess what she was and did. But otherwise, very few women like this one right here. But you can see all the different kinds of people that took part in these gold rushes. And this right here is a dead body that was down in that area where I said the people that trekked up over that pass, they stored their provisions here until they could carry them up over that pass. And this is a dead body that was in that area. So that's it. Gold rushes of the 19th century.
Awesome. Awesome, Rick. We didn't have any questions on Facebook, but I just want to remind people, if they do have any questions about this presentation, you can ask it in the comment section on the right side of your screen on Facebook Live. So we'll give them a minute or so, because I know we're lagging behind, or the Facebook stream lags behind a bit. But
yeah, sorry to take so long. It went longer than I figured. So I hope we still have people watching.
We do, yes. And your immense knowledge on this is highly valued by me and everyone watching. So thanks a bunch. Stands out. It seems like it was a pretty tough go of things there for the miners, uprooting and then having to carry their lives on their backs for a year. So
yeah, well, I always think that, but then my next thought is, what was their alternative?
Mm-hmm.
But when you really look at these different times, and a lot of them were associated with economic depressions, the times were not good anywhere. So what was their option to suffering like this?
Would they bring their whole families along with them when they'd go?
Generally not. Some of them certainly did. I mean, there certainly were exceptions, but generally they just left their families many times in the east and came out themselves. And if they struck it rich, they could bring their families out later. But very, very few, relatively speaking, when you consider the hundreds of thousands that were parts of these rushes, very few actually struck it rich. The only ones that pretty consistently did, or that you could point to as a group, were people that learned how to mine the miners, so to speak. And this is an example. This is from the Klondike, but this is a woman who had established a laundry up in Dawson City, and the people that established saloons and places where the guys could buy food. Those were the people that made monies off the miners, not the miners themselves.
So Bonnie just asked a question if this will be available to watch later. It will be. So I've been recording this the Zoom stream that Rick and I are on, and I'll post it to the Friends of the Dillon Ranger District YouTube page tomorrow, once that gets all downloaded on my computer. And I replied to your comment, Bonnie, and put a link to the FDRD YouTube page. But if you just type in Friends of the Dillon Ranger District, search on YouTube, that should bring you there. Let me check if we got any other questions. Not seeing any. Seems like you covered everything pretty thoroughly, Rick, and as usual, your knowledge is deep on these subjects and very interesting. You know, this is probably my 5th or 6th tour or webinar I've heard from you, and learn lots of new stuff every time. So I really want to thank you for your time that you gave to us today, and a lot of people were able to learn from this. So thanks so much to you, and to everyone for tuning in. I hope you were also able to learn something and gain some more information. Moving forward for FDRD programming, Rick will probably be putting on a couple mining history hikes in the Breckenridge area this summer. So him and I are chatting next week to get some dates on the calendar, but probably in the May newsletter, we will come out with our full slate of educational tours that will be available for everyone. So keep an eye posted on that. And we hope to see you out there this summer. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Huge thanks to you, Rick.
Well, thanks very much. Time for me to go for a swim, huh?
Yep. All right. We'll log off of Facebook here now. All right. Just me and you now, Rick. Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks, Dan.
I hope
I hope it wasn't too long.
Not at all. It was perfect.
How many did we have altogether?
There was 7 tuned in for most of the time. It fluctuated up and down.
Yeah.
Sure. But yeah, 7. We're pretty locked in that whole time. And yeah, as I said, we'll post it to YouTube tomorrow, and hopefully some more tune in via that. I think in our next newsletter we'll put a little blurb about our YouTube, and people can watch and tune into those videos. But yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll talk to you next week then.
Yeah. Is there a day that works well for you? A day or a time?
No, I think the afternoon is generally better than the morning, because I tend to go out and ski in the morning.
Yeah. Awesome. Where do you usually go?
Oh, all over the county. Breck, Copper, Loveland.
Everywhere.
I like to go to all of them. A Basin.
Very cool. Yeah.
I'm not really there.
It's that's like one thing I love about Summit. You can wake up and there's 4 resorts you can ski, 5 resorts you can ski any day. So
yeah.
Not bad for that.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk to you next week then.
Yeah.
And,
Monday.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Afternoon work for you?
Bye. What's that?
Does Monday afternoon work for you?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to do Monday at 3?
Okay, sure.
Sure, I'll send you an email about it just to confirm, but.
Okay, yeah, just to remind me. Okay.
Great, Rick. Thank you so much. We will talk next Monday.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.